Everybody. Thank you all for joining us today to talk about creating an evaluation plan for your child with mental health needs. Tomorrow you'll receive a survey asking for feedback on this workshop. Please do take a few minutes to let us know what worked well and what we could improve on. We appreciate and value your input. After you complete the survey, you will receive the certificate of attendance and some more information sheets related to this topic. Next slide. My name is Karen Malka, and I am presenting today with my colleague Jeannie Claire. I am a parent advocate and the coordinator of the Children's Mental Health and Emotional Behavior Disorders Project here at PACER. I have a background in education, and I have two daughters, ages 24 and 21, both with disabilities, including mental health needs and learning challenges. Jeannie, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Jeannie, as Karen mentioned. We're so happy to have you with us today to talk about mental health special education evaluation. I am a parent advocate and trainer, also in children's mental health at PACER with Karen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the parent of two wonderful kids who are on IEPs and are now young adults. Karen's going to be starting our presentation today, and I'll step in again about halfway through to complete the training before we shift to an opportunity for Q&A at the end. Take it away, Karen.
Thank you. Next slide, please. From today's workshop, we hope you leave with a better understanding of the evaluation planning process, how to address mental health concerns in an evaluation, and knowing what to ask for as you and the team plan an evaluation for your child. Next slide. Is your child having trouble learning at school? If you have concerns your child may be struggling in school, a good first step is to connect with their teacher and ask if they are also noticing any challenges that your child may be having at school. Signs that a child with mental health needs is struggling may include school avoidance, which could look like trouble getting to school, excuse me, skipping classes, and social avoidance. Trouble regulating emotions, such as outbursts, low frustration tolerance, social struggles, a drop in school performance, increased anxiety, sadness, or anger, recent or past trauma that is affecting your child, trouble with focus and impulse control. Other factors that may contribute to a student struggling at school may include needs related to vision, hearing, speech, motor skills, a physical impairment, or health condition. Once a concern is identified, parents or guardians have a right to request a comprehensive special education evaluation, verbally or in writing. Public and charter schools must ensure all students with disabilities have access to a free, appropriate public education, known as FAPE, under the Individual with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. Under another federal law called Child Find, public school districts have a responsibility to identify students with disabilities attending public and private schools in their district. Because of these laws, teachers or school staff may also initiate an evaluation for a student if they have concerns. Next slide. What is a special education evaluation? Special education evaluations assess educational need to determine whether your student is eligible for special education under the federal law IDEA. Special education provides direct instruction, modifications, and accommodations tailored to help your child learn with an individual education program, or an IEP. A special education evaluation must be comprehensive. Every student has a right to a complete and accurate evaluation, which means that it should address all areas of suspected disability and potential educational need. An evaluation may include assessment of, but not limited to, intellectual, academic, behavioral, physical, social, and communication needs. The assessments the IEP team chooses to include in the evaluation should be based on your concerns as well as the concerns of the school. Information in the evaluation must come from a variety of sources, such as informal and formal data, interviews, observations, and review of any relevant past data. Measures used to evaluate a child include assessing educational needs to determine eligibility for services, background information, education, medical family history, comparison of a child's progress to typical development, observations of how a child functions across settings, including home, school, and the community, interviews with the parent, guardian, school, staff, and the student, surveys, scales, or inventories completed by parent or guardian, school staff, and the student. Some examples of these are a mental health survey or inventories of behavior and executive functioning. All tests used must be reliable, valid, non-discriminatory, given in the child's first language, and provide an accurate reflection of a child's aptitude, achievement, strengths, and needs. These assessments provide data about what level of educational support is appropriate for a child. We will talk more about different types of tests and data in a bit. It is important to note that parents are not expected to understand or know about every test available or what they measure. It is helpful, however, to have an understanding of the broader areas of tests commonly used, and parents should be sure to share all concerns with the IEP team and review the evaluation plan to ensure there are assessments to gather information about each concern. Next slide, please. What does the special education evaluation process look like? Now that we know a little more about what an evaluation is, let's talk about the process. The first step in the process is initiating the process. This is done by the parent requesting a special education evaluation or the school making a referral for an evaluation. At PACER, we always recommend that parents make a request for evaluation in writing and include all concerns and how they impact your student's ability to access their education. Once the district receives the request for the evaluation, they must respond with a form called a prior written notice, either agreeing or refusing your request to evaluate. The prior written notice includes a section where they explain the district's decision. If they are refusing the request to evaluate, they may ask for a meeting to discuss your concerns, propose to try some interventions first, such as teaching them differently, temporarily providing extra supports to see if they catch up. You do have the right to request that the district move forward with the evaluation without delay. If the school has refused to evaluate, they must explain why in the prior written notice, and you then have 14 days to either agree or disagree with their decision. If you disagree, you can request a conciliation conference. This is a type of meeting to discuss why you have disagreed and then try to resolve the dispute. This meeting needs to happen within 10 days of your objection. If the district agrees to evaluate, the parent must be given a chance to give input into the evaluation plan. It is important to note that parents are a part of the IEP team along with the special education teacher, general education teacher, district representative, someone who can interpret test results, and the student when appropriate. Be sure to save a copy of the prior written notice. The second step in the process is developing the initial evaluation plan. Once parents and the district agree to an evaluation and that it is needed, the next They next need to agree on areas of potential concerns to address in the evaluation. During this step, the parent has an opportunity to share all their concerns and observations. Remember that you are the expert on your child and you know them better than anyone else. You are the only member of the team who sees your child in many environments and knows and understands their history, life experiences, and developmental, emotional, behavioral, physical health. Be sure to share what you know about your child and ask questions. Jamie, I'm going to pause the PowerPoint so I can share my screen. So I want to take a minute and show you an example of an evaluation plan, and so you can see it. And again, this is a sample. At the top of the sample plan, you'll see that it tells you PWN, which stands for prior written notice, with an intent to evaluate, and it also includes the details of the student. It's important to note also, here is the date sent. That is important. If it's an initial evaluation, the team cannot evaluate without your consent. However, if it is a reevaluation, which is required every 3 years, if you do not provide consent within that 14-day period on the prior written notice, the school can go ahead and redo a reevaluation. In order to qualify for special education and have an IEP, a student must meet criteria in at least one disability category. There are 13 different disability categories, and each one has a checklist made up of different criteria. The data collected in the evaluation process helps guide which items on the checklist apply and if the student meets criteria. For students with mental health needs, the most common disability categories are EBD, which stands for Emotional Behavior Disorder, ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder, and OHD, Other Health Disorder. It is important to remember that a disability category is not a diagnosis. And an example of that, a school evaluation is not a diagnostic tool. So when we talk about disability categories, that's an educational disability category. We have seen students, for example, who have a medical diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder who do not qualify under who do not qualify for special education through a school evaluation and vice versa. We've also seen students who do not have a medical diagnosis of autism and they do qualify and meet the checklist criteria for ASD in the school. Also, a diagnosis is not needed to have an evaluation. The next sections on the plan are divided by performance areas. Under each area, the plan includes which assessments will be done, any subtests or extra details, and who will be administering the assessment. So if you see here, for example, it says performance area. This area is intellectual cognitive functioning. Here they're listing the different assessments that they may do and some subtests. So for this student, they're going to do a cognitive intelligence general ability test. They're looking at verbal comprehension, visual spatial fluid reasoning, and the other things listed here. And in this column, we'll list who will be performing those tests. If the student has any outside testing, such as neuropsychological assessment, you can share that with the school. The school should consider the information you share, but they are not required to follow the recommendations from that assessor. Intellectual testing, such as IQ tests, can't be measured more than once within 1 year, or results could be considered null and void. So these are under the IQ tests. oftentimes if the school has done a school evaluation and then you'd go for an outside evaluation, the evaluator may not repeat that if it's been done within a year and vice versa. If the student has had it outside done, the school may not repeat that. The next section, so here is academic performance. Different tests for that. You can see they're looking for this student at reading, fluency, comprehension, written, also looking at math, listing the assessments they're going to be using, and again, who will be administering it. Know that you do not need to understand all of the different kinds of subtests they can complete or the jargon for these areas. Based on your input, they will determine which test to administer. You can let them know you are concerned. Your child does not understand what they are reading, or they have trouble sounding out words or longer words. You do not need to be an expert, so just share what you know in your words. And so what I mean by that is don't feel that you need to know walking into this, I want this test done, or you don't need to know the name of the assessment. But you definitely would want to say, I'm concerned about my child's reading comprehension and fluency, and I would like an assessment done to measure that. The next section looks at health. The health section of the evaluation plan includes a review of relevant medical records and assessments, including vision, hearing, and motor skills. Some students will also be assessed to see if they qualify for adapted physical education. These are often the vision and hearing screening will be done by the nurse and reviewing any medical records that are related to the evaluation. Motor skills, usually done by the occupational therapist. And the developmental adaptive physical education assessment, which is DAPE, done usually by a physical education teacher. The section on emotional, social, and behavioral development is important for planning assessments for students with mental health needs. Many students with mental health needs also exhibit behaviors at school. Some may be outward behaviors, such as outbursts, physical aggression, irritability, and interrupting. And some may be internalized behaviors, such as withdrawn, not social, sadness, avoidance, and not engaging. Because of this, one important part of an evaluation for these students is called a functional behavior assessment, or an FBA. An FBA identifies a behavior and helps identify the function of it by looking at the triggers when the behavior occurs and when the behavior does not occur. One thing that we often mention, and I just mentioned it now, but oftentimes schools will look at the triggers of a behavior and take note of when the behavior is happening, but oftentimes forget to look at where it's not happening. So if you notice this when your child is assessed and you don't see mention of where the behavior is not happening, that may be something you want to ask for, as that can provide good information about not just what's not working, but what is working. What constitutes an FBA can be a bit ambiguous. There is no set requirements on which assessment tools the team uses, but it should be a combination of informal and formal tools. These may include behavior rating skills, sensory processing, and adaptive behavior assessment, as well as self-help and functional skills that may include developmental rating skills, observations and interviews, and sometimes an autism spectrum disorder checklist or assessment. We always encourage parents to make a list of all their concerns and then make sure that they are addressed by the different assessments the team is proposing. Again, some of these categories of the types of assessment will vary depending on the parents and the school's concerns. Just to finish this out, here's a section on self-help, functional skills. Most of the time, probably all the time, when a student with mental health needs or behavioral concerns is being evaluated, there will be a school psychologist and an occupational therapist as part of that evaluation team. Down here is communication and speech. Those evaluations are done, those assessments are done usually by speech and language pathologist who works for the district. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. Once you have looked over the evaluation plan and signed off on it, the school has 30 school days to complete the evaluation and get results to you. This is done at an evaluation results meeting. Based on the findings, it will be determined if the student meets criteria in any of the disability category areas. It is important to note that regardless of disability category, once a student has an IEP, the school must address all the student's needs. And what I mean by that is if a student enters an IEP through the disability category, for example, other health disability due to their anxiety, if they're struggling in reading, that need also needs to be serviced, even if they didn't qualify under a learning disability. And so once you go through the door into special education, they need to look at the whole child and all of the needs. If the student does not qualify for special education, and if the student does qualify for special education, an IEP will be written and implemented once the parent signs off on the proposed IEP. If the student does not meet criteria for special education based on evaluation results, the parent has a right to disagree with the results, or if the parent does agree with the results, they can talk with a team about next steps to best support the student. A PACER advocate can also help you understand your rights and possible next steps. Next slide. Jeannie, I'll let you continue.
Yep, I forgot to unmute my mute button. Thanks, Karen. So this is Jeannie. I am back to go over the remaining slides. Thank you all, those of you who are putting questions in the Q&A section. I responded to a few of them that I could respond to quickly, but that you've got great questions. So keep them coming, and we'll, Karen may be able to address some of those now while we talk, but we'll also have that time at the end for some discussion of those questions. So if I didn't get back to you, or you don't see an answer to your question, we'll address those coming up here. So this slide, which has lots and lots of text, gives us a chance to look at a specific example of an initial first-time special education evaluation request from a fictitious mom named Jenna regarding her fictitious student, Jude. I'll give you a minute to scan through it and just read the highlights of the request letter. And we'll talk more about each section in the next slide. So we'll break this down a little bit to help understand how it'll apply to the evaluation process. But you'll notice here that this letter includes the formal request for evaluation. It identifies outside provider disability diagnoses, although outside diagnoses are not always required when requesting an evaluation. Districts are obligated to evaluate students with a suspected disability. There are diagnoses, outside diagnoses required for some disability assessment areas, but if you have concerns about your child's ability to access their education, you don't necessarily have to have an outside diagnosis unless it falls into a particular category. And that's something that you can reach out to a PACER advocate to talk to get more information, or review the resources that were included in your email. So this letter also provides a summary of observations received by the parent from school staff about areas where the student is having difficulties. If you don't have a record of notes from teachers or you haven't received any input from teachers, but you're observing challenges anyway, you don't need to include this section. It also lists notes about where the parent, where you are observing education-related struggles. This is where we'll focus our attention in the next slide. And it requests a timely response from the district, including your preferred contact information. Next slide, Jamie. So let's take time now to break down Jenna's eval request letter. We'll use her examples of areas of difficulty specific to Jude. Your eval request will look different because it will reflect your own students' needs and challenges. Our discussion here will attempt to align Jenna's concerns to some of the evaluation assessment examples Karen shared, to just kind of give you an idea of how the school might translate concerns into a plan for evaluation. So let's start with Jenna's first area of concern, following directions. Sometimes a student who isn't following directions can be viewed by the school as being non-compliant. This means that the district may be viewing a student's behaviors as intentional rather than giving consideration to possible disability challenges a student might be experiencing that make it difficult or sometimes impossible for a student to comply with certain expectations or follow directions. Factors such as a child's cognitive or auditory processing speed, working memory capacity, or receptive language skills may be making it difficult for them to hear, process, and follow directions. The team may need to ensure that assessments in these areas are included in the eval plan. As the parent, you don't need to know what kind of testing is needed or the name of the relevant assessment, as Karen had mentioned. You'll have a chance to ask for clarifications on what's included in the eval plan before you sign it. Your role is to make sure you express the challenges you are observing. Your role in sending this letter in, this request for evaluation. So we'll talk more about your role later. Next, Jenna listed getting to school as a challenge for Jude. There are a number of factors such as anxiety, depression, fatigue, or social problems that may contribute to a student's reluctance to go to school. A functional behavioral assessment, or FBA, which Karen also went over, is an assessment tool that relies on feedback from parents, teachers, and sometimes students. It helps the school to better understand the student in their home, school, and other relevant environments. When the school analyzes patterns of behaviors and triggers in the environment, such as the time of day when behaviors are likely to occur, or environmental factors such as sensitivity to loud classrooms, certain kinds of interactions, the team can integrate this understanding into developing an educational plan to support progress. Next, Jenna notes completing work. Difficulties with completing work may be rooted in anxiety, learning challenges, attention or executive functioning deficits, or other factors. Academic performance testing may be one avenue the team pursues to take a closer look at reading and math, to create a baseline of understanding related to the student's academic strengths and weaknesses. These assessment scores might indicate a specific learning disability or other concern identified in a subcategory. If academic test scores are in the average range, this may point to anxiety or perception about the work rather than a learning difficulty. Navigating social situations and self-advocacy. When a student experiences big behaviors at school, staff may struggle to understand that these behaviors might be due to a student's undeveloped skills for emotional regulation, social engagement, self-advocacy, or other communication concerns rather than a willful noncompliance. Conversely, as Karen mentioned, when a student with mental health needs internalizes these struggles, symptoms may be more subtle and difficult for staff to observe, such as social withdrawal. In this case, the parent interview portions of evaluation can be especially helpful. Parent insights, and especially student insights, if the student is willing and developmentally able to provide them, provide important windows of understanding related to why the student may be struggling, so that a plan can be developed to effectively support them. Motor coordination, Karen mentioned DAPE. If a student experiences anxiety when it comes to gym class, an assessment related to their physical capacities may be merited. Social, emotional, intellectual development should also be considered. There are all kinds of reasons that anxiety about gym class could be occurring. So you want to make sure that you're looking into all possibilities there. So, and I want to add here, while this consideration wasn't included on Jenna's list of concerns for Jude, I want to add a note about sensory processing struggles. Karen highlighted it in the evaluation plan example. We all experience sensory input somewhat differently, but the brains of individuals with sensory processing challenges have trouble receiving and responding to information that comes through our senses. So this means a student may be over responding or under responding to certain sensory inputs such as loud sounds, smells, taste, textures, touch, lighting, or movement. This can make it difficult for the student to process and respond to sensory input in a manner that allows them to engage effectively at school. Another area that I just wanted to highlight from that evaluation plan that Karen went over is communication. Social communication, pragmatic language, these can also be factors that sometimes merit consideration by the district. And that's something to note. If you're noticing some of those challenges, the team doesn't always include, for example, an OT in the evaluation process. So you may want to highlight sensory integration needs and request that an OT provide an assessment in that area. Same with communication. So make sure, just to reiterate, we've said it a whole bunch of times, but make sure that your request includes all areas of concern. Okay, so again, Jenna's eval request letter and our discussion on this slide cover only a few areas of concern related to one particular fictitious student. When you send a request for evaluation to the district, keep in mind that you can and should expect that comprehensiveness. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to follow up on that as we move along. But you want to make sure every concern you have related to your child's ability to engage with their education is included. And the reason we keep emphasizing that is because that evaluation is meant to cast a wide net. If you miss something that's important, we're talking about mental health evaluations here, which often, when the focus is mental health, it's often triggered by behaviors. And sometimes those behaviors, as we're talking about here, come from disability needs that have not yet been understood, acknowledged, or addressed. So if there are needs that are left unacknowledged, the student may still continue to struggle at school, and behavior may be the only way they know to communicate their frustration and their lack of skills in a certain area to meet expectations. Okay, next slide, Jamie. Okay, so far we've discussed your rights regarding special education evaluation. Karen covered what is measured through evaluation and how the process works. We've looked at a sample letter from Jenna, our fictitious parent, and talked through how the team might address Jenna's concern via assessments in the evaluation. So before our question and answer time, I want to review the steps of the evaluation from start to finish. So first, you will have requested evaluation, preferably in writing. Keeping things in writing is a good way to create accountability and a point of reference for discussions in the future. Next, if the district agrees to evaluate, an evaluation plan is then developed by the school based on your concerns and their observations, and you should be included in that conversation. A plan of assessments is then written into a prior written notice for your review. Your questions about the plan should at this point have been answered, and you will have verified that it includes assessments in all areas of concern. You understand that your role in the process will then include completing interviews and surveys, as well as submitting any medical documentation that may be required for certain disability categories. If this is an initial or first special education evaluation for your student, the school will not move forward with the process until you sign your consent to the plan via the prior written notice that Karen shared earlier, the example. If it's a reevaluation being conducted for your child, and you wish to object to the evaluation proposal, you must disagree in writing via prior written notice, otherwise known as PWN. In this case, you have 14 calendar days of receipt of the prior written notice to return your written signature of disagreement to the school. For reevaluation, if you disagree and don't return the prior written notice within 14 days, the school can move forward with reevaluation without your approval. So once you've signed your agreement to the eval or re-eval plan, the school has 30 school days to complete the process. The summary meeting with parents to go over the evaluation results is also included in this 30-day window. Once the evaluation is complete, the eval summary meeting will be scheduled. This will include a discussion about the determination of the student's eligibility for special education services. The team should go over with you the data, conclusions, and recommendations from the report. Keep in mind that you have the right to an accurate and comprehensive evaluation. Evaluation summary reports can be lengthy, often 25 to 35 pages. It can feel a little overwhelming. You have the right to ask questions and request clarifications about the report. So don't hesitate to engage the team in discussion about your questions or concerns. And I really want to encourage all of you, if you've not been through the evaluation process before, seeing those reports for the first time can really be overwhelming in a lot of ways. It's a lot of data, it's a lot of insights you may not have had about your students. So both the data and the emotional aspect can be overwhelming. So take your time. And please know that other parents experience the same thing. You're not alone, and you do have the right to take your time to ensure that staff answer your questions and clarify anything that you don't understand. If you disagree with the evaluation results, you have a couple of options. You can state your disagreement and request an alternative dispute resolution meeting. Or in some cases, it may be appropriate to request what's called an independent education evaluation at district expense. So I threw in some new terms at the end there, and we won't have time to go through information in all of those areas today. The information that we did cover, we went through very quickly. Karen and I, as parents of kids with disabilities of our own, we understand that this process can be a lot. So if you're a Minnesota parent and you'd like an advocate to review documents with you, or to learn more about the special education processes we've discussed today, and your options within this process, please don't hesitate to reach out to PACER, and an advocate will be matched with you to answer your questions, provide resources, and discuss advocacy planning options. And you do have quite a few resources included in your email that you received with the link to the presentation. So a lot of questions and clarifications may be available there once you have a chance to check those out. And now it looks like we have about 20 minutes to move to Q&A.
And I was able to answer a bunch of questions.
Okay.
So I did go ahead and do that, but I guess we can.
All right. Do you want to just, since you've kind of been keeping an eye on what you've
Sure.
answered and what you haven't, do you want to kind of roll through and
Yeah, so
and
let's see, is FBA assessment in school responsibility for student with symptoms? I think that's asking, is it the school's responsibility to do an FBA? Yes. That doesn't mean that they always do it. Sometimes if you have a student who is already on, let's say already on an IEP, and there are new behaviors, or your child is struggling, you can ask the school to conduct either a new or an initial FBA to gather more information, which will lead into either updating or creating a behavior support plan. Next question. When a student is identified as gifted and also qualifies for an IEP for other reasons, are they required to meet their gifted learning needs? Jeannie, do you have thoughts on that one?
Um, well, yeah, the district is required to provide a free and appropriate public education, which should challenge the skills and abilities of that student. So, schools do have to integrate strengths, and that's very much part of the IEP planning conversation is integration of strengths and ensuring that that student has high expectations incorporated into their educational plan. Karen, you have anything to add to that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah. Does the evaluation have to be limited to challenges for the student only in the academic environment? For instance, issues with lunch, recess, getting to school and entering the building, school avoidance, etc. That's a really good question, and it's something we deal with all the time. Yes, so the evaluation should also address those concerns. Lunch and recess is part of school. Walking into the school building is part of school. Transportation, if provided by the school, such as busing, is part of school. So yes, sometimes, the lines are blurred a little bit. I've had situations where parents are really struggling with their kiddo at home and the child is having no behaviors at school. Um, that could be a different type of situation. Schools might not address that, but if the behaviors at home are causing the student not to be able to attend school or has school avoidance, then yes, they should be including those social emotional pieces. Anything else to add on that one?
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you brought up, Karen, in relation to behaviors that are seen in one area versus the other. Um, Homework is another one, and that goes back to the discussion about disability impact, sometimes sensory impact. When a student who has disabilities is trying really, really hard at school all day, every day, but they're struggling maybe more than their general education peers because they're not receiving the supports that they need. Sometimes those students will do what's called masking at school, where they kind of contain all that stress and pressure, and then when they get home, it just all comes out because they can't contain it anymore. And that's also a case in which sometimes homework becomes a challenge because they just need a space to breathe. So that's a good question, and the opposite occurs sometimes too, where behaviors are not seen at home, but they are seen at school. One thing that can be helpful when you have discussions with the team is to share some of those insights. You can just point out, we have, there are lots of reasons why we might be seeing different characteristics or different behaviors with a student. So let's make sure we factor in those differences. What does the student look like in each environment? And as you look at IEP planning, if a student is eligible for IEP services or even 504 or interventions, if they're not found eligible, those observations can be really, really helpful in terms of putting together a support plan for the student in general. And I don't want to get ahead of our conversation to here because we want to keep it focused on evaluation, but those insights can be very relevant and important.
Next question. Hi, Norma. With the reevaluation, is the evaluation planning meeting optional? As a surrogate, I am often told we don't need to meet, and my experience is that it is very important to meet, especially if new data is requested. So yes, it is optional, but the parents definitely can request a meeting. If the parents request it, then it is not optional. There are times where a reevaluation comes out of an IEP meeting, especially if it's not during that 3-year time. Sometimes the team will send you the evaluation plan without meeting, but definitely if parents want to meet, then it's not optional. They should be meeting. Anything to add to that, Jeannie?
No.
Let's see. So this is someone that I had already answered the question, but they have another question related to it. School says these areas are not academic in the gen ed classroom, so cannot do anything for it or evaluate for it. Trying to remember how that's related to the last.
Karen, I believe that might have been an extension of the question at 1226. From, does the eval have to be limited to challenges for the student only in an academic environment?
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Jen.
Oh, got it. Okay. So I think that we answered it. Yeah, if the school is saying these areas are not academic in the general education classroom, no. From the moment the student is on their way to school to the moment they leave school, that all includes areas of concern. We know that concerns don't only happen in the classroom. Sometimes it's concerning students can't even get to the classroom because of, anxiety or something they're experiencing. And definitely lunch and recess and specials, art class, music, whatever it may be, are also areas that should be looked at.
And that's something that
Yeah.
we will sometimes hear parents tell us that they've heard from districts. If their students' grades are fine, then they're not going to evaluate because their grades are fine. And that is not the criteria for evaluation. So a student can have other disability impact needs and still have very good grades, and those needs may still need to be addressed if they're impacting their ability to access their education.
Absolutely. And one of the questions that I answered while you were presenting, Jeannie, someone asked something to that, said that the school was saying, well, the student has average academics, so we don't need to assess that. And that's not true. The assessment the evaluation should be comprehensive. And the purpose of the evaluation is not only to identify needs, but also to be able to identify the present level of functioning of the student. So it does need to be evaluated. Okay, when the report is reviewed by the team and the diagnosis has multiple diagnoses for the scholar, does the school have to agree to the results of the diagnosis? Example, the diagnosis stated the scholar met criteria for dyslexia. However, the team does not agree that the child needs services in that area. Can the school refuse to provide dyslexia services if they do not agree with the diagnosis from the So I think you're referring to an outside diagnosis. And as we mentioned in the presentation, the school does not diagnose medical. It's not a diagnostic tool, it's an educational evaluation. So a school evaluation will never come back saying your student has ADHD or your student has FASD or and often won't say also your student has dyslexia. There are times, this happened with my own daughter, that she did have a diagnosis of dyslexia and did not meet criteria for a reading learning disability at school. And I know it can be so frustrating. The way that we got her in is, oftentimes kids who are struggling with dyslexia and don't meet criteria for a learning disability have oftentimes a lot of anxiety because school is really hard. So sometimes they can enter a special education through other health disability because of their anxiety. And once they're through that door of special education, then the reading concerns and those things do need to be addressed. Anything else you want to add to that one, Jeannie?
No, other than to just kind of reiterate what you said, it's confusing, the whole diagnosis thing, because when you get an IEP and it has an eligibility category listing, it could say ASD for autism. They qualified under autism. Well, that sounds like a diagnosis. It's not. It's the outside provider that provides an actual medical or other diagnosis for a student's disabilities. What the school evaluation measures is the impact of a student's potential disability on the educational environment, their ability to access their education. So, for example, and Karen gave a really good example of this with dyslexia, and sometimes a student qualifying instead under anxiety and having those needs met. There are some students that have autism, they have outside diagnoses of autism, but when the district conducts a special education evaluation, they don't see an impact from that disability in the educational environment. So they won't necessarily qualify for services under autism. And feel free to reach out. This is another one of those circumstances where sometimes it's easier to talk about specifics with a parent rather than examples. So feel free to reach out to PACER, any of you who are kind of struggling through what this means and what it looks like and what you should expect.
And I'll also just add to that as well is the IEP or special education is not the only way to get help at school. So oftentimes, and again, a PACER advocate can help you through that to discuss options and next steps. But oftentimes, if a student does not meet criteria for an IEP, we can talk about possibly if a 504 plan, which is an accommodation plan, or just talking to the school about what supports they can put in place. Is there someone at PACER that can help with trying to get special education for a homeschool student? That's a really good question. And it's pretty much the same answer also as for a student in a private school. You still can turn to your public school district and provide in writing a request to evaluate. So if a student is at a private school, the public school can still do that evaluation. If they do qualify for services in special education, the student and the parent accepts those services. Oftentimes the student will be bused from the private school or homeschool to the school to receive those services. So that's how that works. Should an FBA on an evaluation plan be specific as to what they are incorporating into the FBA, since an FBA is so ambiguous? What should we request as elements in an FBA? Jeannie, do you want to do that one?
Yes, I did. This is such a great question. The short answer is no. They can just write down that they're conducting an FBA. And there isn't necessarily a standard tool that districts use for an FBA. So the district gets to choose which tool they're going to use for the FBA. Which format they're going to use. And that's true for the other assessments also. So the parent can't dictate which assessment the district will use. However, an FBA, and it sounds like this parent is somewhat familiar with maybe the pros and cons of current FBA formats. One way to address this is to ask at the evaluation planning meeting, what will that FBA look like? What are you going to look for? What are your observations going to include? If you're concerned that the FBA may not be collecting all the data that you think is relevant to these behavioral concerns, you can request additional data. And this is something that, I would encourage you to call us to talk more about this. Sometimes FBAs and districts are really good about digging into what's happening with a student. Why is this behavior occurring? And sometimes that doesn't happen. So one of those considerations that you want to look at is, for example, I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head, but well, I'll use an example that I used in a recent presentation related to my son. He was really struggling to get to his service providers. He had one service provider in his IEP that he just wasn't going. His other service providers in his IEP, he had already qualified. His other service providers it worked fine, but he could not get to this, refuse to engage with the service provider. And so I asked for an FBA. And again, you can have a standalone FBA, which is something that we didn't talk about. So FBA can be part of evaluation, or it can be done separately for a student on a 504 or on an IEP. I asked for an FBA, and they said, no, we're not going to conduct an FBA because we already know why he's not going. He doesn't want to. And I said, well, I wonder why he doesn't want to. Maybe exploring why he doesn't want to would help us to engage him with that service provider. And they said no, and they did not conduct that FBA. And I sat down with my son and said, what isn't working there for you? And he gave me some very specific reasons right off the top of his head. He had dysgraphia, which means he doesn't handwrite well, really struggles with that. And it involved a lot of worksheets. It didn't apply to anything relevant in real life, so he couldn't apply what he was learning. There were a number of great insights, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about including student insights when possible. But in response to your question, and I'm sorry I'm making this answer so long, sometimes you can dig in and encourage the district to look a little bit further. So instead of an FBA saying they're not engaging because they don't want to, you can say, I wonder if we can consider, let's gather some observation data about what's happening there. What isn't working? What is working in other environments that we could apply? And again, that's crossing over into the actual IEP planning. But connect with Pacer if you have questions about it. And just know that FBA piece may be limited in terms of the format the school uses, but you can always request additional data and observations from the district. Karen, was
Yeah,
that
yeah, thank you.
succinct enough?
Yep.
A lot of rambling.
Okay, next one. I noticed the letter was addressed to the principal. Should we be reaching out with desire for testing to the classroom teacher, sped teacher, principal, or all three? I don't want the teacher to feel I'm going over their heads. I often recommend sending, an email to all three. Really depends on the school. Usually a special ed director or, the general ed teacher also can, pass that information along. So whatever the comfort level is. But definitely copying the regular teacher with that, then it might not feel that you're going over their head. How can parents of middle and high school students advocate for their children if they have not been identified as in special education and the district is using eligibility rules for sports and behavior rules in regular ed to exclude their child? That's another thing, unfortunately, we see often. If they're not in special education, as I mentioned before, another route is to do that 504 plan, which will provide documentation of a disability. And if you're really feeling that that student is being discriminated against, reaching out to the Office of Civil Rights is a good place to start for that. Anything to add on that, Jeannie?
No.
Do the days that the school is to do the evaluation depend on the state you live in? Good question.
Yeah,
think,
federal timeline is 60 days for evaluation. Your state may have different. Minnesota's timeline is 30 days. So every district has to meet at least the standards set by federal law, but your state can build on that.
What if the school doesn't get the evaluation completed in the 30 days? You do have a right to file a complaint with the Minnesota Department of Ed, if you feel that there's a violation of the process, especially if they haven't contacted you or checked in with you or asked for an extension or something like that. But that would be, you could give us a call or MD. I live in Montana and they told me 60 days. Yep. As Jeannie mentioned, the federal law requires 60 days. Some states like Minnesota, it's 30 days. And it can't be more than 60. It can be less depending on the state you live in. Does a district have to comply with a request for evaluation? If not, what recourse do parents have? Again, that's the importance of that prior written notice. They need to tell you if they are refusing to do an evaluation, they need to provide you in writing in that prior written notice. And then you have the opportunity to disagree with their decision. The recourse or the next steps to that would be to start the due process options. And the first one would be that conciliation meeting. There's also mediation as well. So yes, there are options, but again, disagreeing with that prior written notice is the first step to get that ball rolling. Any possible, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Karen mentioned a law called Child Find, which obligates districts to evaluate any student with a suspected disability. The law also states that districts can try interventions first. So, they might try a social skills class, or they might try positive behavioral interventions and support, or social emotional learning programming. If you request evaluation and they say, hey, we would like to try these things first before we evaluate, they have the right to do that. But you also have the right to disagree. So that would constitute a refusal. So if your kiddo is in crisis, if they're really struggling with getting to school or with behaviors, or they're experiencing suspensions or other challenges that are really building with stress, you can use that prior written notice. If they've said, nah, let's try these other things first, and you feel like your kiddo can't wait, you can say, I prefer that we move forward with evaluation, so I'm going to disagree with your refusal, and request one of the dispute resolution meeting options to pursue moving forward with evaluation. So, and again, that's something that you can call Pacer and follow up if you have a specific question about that. And we'd be happy to help walk you through what your options are there.
Any possibility of an FBA for school avoidance? I don't know.
Yes.
I've seen it more in avoidance in a way where a student is eloping from a classroom. So for example, they're leaving the classroom or not going into class. Haven't seen it as much for a student who won't leave the house to go to school. I don't know, Jeannie, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky. And again, it kind of moves into specifics. That touches a little bit on that example that I shared with my son. And I think it's a really good and important question. And it highlights one of the areas where FBAs can sometimes kind of fall short, because we need to understand avoidant behaviors. We need a tool to be able to dig in and talk through with parents, with teachers. What are you noticing? What's contributing to avoidance? So that's that nuanced pursuit of data collection that I was referring to before. And I wish so much that we had like another hour and we could really dig into some of these questions, because you all have fantastic questions, and I don't want to keep saying call Pacer, but we really do want to be able to help you work through these, because the questions you're asking here are questions we hear a lot. You're not alone. There are other parents that are experiencing similar situations.
You think we have time for one or two more?
It's a little bit after 1. I do have a little bit more time.
Okay.
We want to be respectful of people's time. So if anyone needs to duck off right now, I think Karen mentioned that an evaluation will be going out. We did send resources in the email that included this link. So feel free to look at those. We covered a lot of information, and oftentimes if you look through those handouts right away afterwards, or as soon as you have a chance, what you've heard auditorily and what you've seen on the slides will click in and connect with you, and you'll feel a little bit more confident about the knowledge if you have a chance to review those. And again, call us if we can help walk you through it. So Karen, it's up to you. Do you want to continue with?
Yeah, maybe I'll just, I can kind of read these and just kind of summarize quickly some of these answers. One parent is asking, if I don't know what testing is available, I have a sense my child is struggling with reading, but not sure what part, phonics, comprehension. Just ask for a comprehensive evaluation, and then they'll be looking at everything. Currently, child already is on an IEP for ASD. There's some new trauma that's happening, and they want to have a reevaluation. This takes a lot of time, and my son is currently not able to attend school due to triggers for the last 3 weeks. Is there options to expedite the timelines the school district has to complete it? Yes, you can always make that request to expedite an evaluation. It's not always granted, but definitely you can ask for that. And also, you can ask what supports can be added right now while you're waiting for a reeval results. What about aftercare or enrichment programs provided by the school? I believe if they are provided by the school, they have to provide, if there's para support or supports. If it's an outside agency that is just using space in the school, I don't believe that they have to. I think that, do you know, Jeannie?
My understanding was that aftercare and enrichment programming must abide by ADA, so accommodations, and anything that's in the IEP related to extracurriculars or school-sponsored programming must be followed. But the IEP, that's a question that somebody might want to call in and talk to us more about, I think.
What about field trips? Can the school require a parent chaperone in order for the child to participate? Again, I think talk to your team, find out what the needs are on a field trip, and then decide what would be the best way for the student to access, because the field trips are considered part of education.
Yeah.
I think if there's para support built into the IEP, that should include field trips.
They have to make it possible for the student to participate in the field trip. And they cannot require, from what I understand, and Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, they can't require the parent to fill that role of support to enable that student to participate. Is that correct?
I
from your
believe so, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
He meets criteria for SLD, however, we are not in agreement that he needs services for dyslexia. That's something that also happens sometimes. Sometimes the evaluation team will say, yes, your student meets criteria, here's the services we'd like to provide, and parents don't agree with that. Again, you have the option to disagree with a proposed IEP, and then discuss, the services and try and come to an agreement about that. If a parent decides that even though their child has qualified for an IEP, if they decide we're just not ready, we don't want to do that right now, you have the right to decline that. And I believe you have 1 year to reopen that without doing another evaluation. I think. A child qualifies for OHD with ADHD, but later gets anxiety disorder. Can the district address the anxiety? Yes. If new needs pop up, they still need to continue to support that student. If there's a brand new diagnosis of, let's say, autism or some others circumstances that pop up, they may want to do a reevaluation just to see, if they want to look at another disability category, that would require a reevaluation.
And if the anxiety, it may have been noted in the previous evaluation, but hadn't been addressed in the IEP. So that might be a first step to take a look at whether it was already identified. Districts aren't obligated to meet a need that is not identified in the evaluation. So that kind of speaks to what Karen was saying. If it's new information and no one assessed for it, I'm wondering if they qualified under OHD with ADHD, if they may have taken a look at it and checking that previous eval first can be a tool to say, hey, I kind of missed this the first time, but that need was identified in the previous evaluation, and now we're seeing an increase, and now we have an additional diagnosis. Let's make sure we're addressing it in our support to the student, or they may need to do an early reevaluation and add in assessments related to that additional need. They don't need a new category. Once the student has qualified under a specific disability area, the district must meet all disability-related needs identified in the evaluation.
Okay, two more. If a school says they will provide informal accommodations, but they don't put them in the IEP, does this require a reeval? No. They do not need to do a reevaluation for that. You at any time can call for an IEP team meeting and share your concerns that you feel that the IEP is not working or there needs to be some updated accommodations, and that can be amended at any time without a reevaluation. Okay, last one. What do you do when the evaluation is dysregulating to the child? What if the school is gaslighting or triggering your child in their response to behaviors? What if the school is asking for a behavioral contract and hasn't completed the FBA process? It can be really difficult, especially for students with mental health challenges, to undergo the evaluation process. I think talking to the school about breaking things down, doing it in smaller chunks. Sometimes if there's an issue with a staff member, something like that, just talking about maybe having somebody else do certain things if that's possible. Jeannie, I'll let you, do you want to?
Yeah, you can request accommodations for testing. Karen listed a few really good ones that can be utilized for a number of different emotional behavioral needs that might interfere with evaluation. Another thing that I've sometimes suggested to parents is if the student sees an outside provider, like a therapist, or if they've had a neuropsych assessment, or someone else that kind of understands what works for them and what doesn't, and can make specific recommendations about how they might accommodate the student to evaluate, that information can be helpful. Again, the district doesn't have to follow outside provider recommendations, but typically if the school's conducting an evaluation, they want to understand the student's needs. They want the opportunity to evaluate. And if they're running into challenges about how to do that effectively, they can reach out, or you can share as a parent information and recommendations from an outside provider. Or if they're struggling, they can also bring in additional resources. So you can also say, I hear you, you're really struggling with knowing how to engage my student. Who else have you spoken with? What are their ideas? Who else can we bring into the conversation as part of this team to discuss how we can ensure that we effectively evaluate my kiddo, so that we can support them.
And then the last part of that question was that the school is asking for a behavioral contract and hasn't completed the FBA process. So I've worked with some families where the school has developed a behavior contract, and sometimes that's not in the best interest of the student. I think a student on an IEP, that is the behavior contract, so to speak. I think sometimes the behavior contracts that schools try to implement kind of have an assumption that students' behaviors are choices. And they tend to focus more on behavior rather than the disability. So again, you do not have to agree to those behavior contracts. And I definitely would agree that an FBA should be done before any talk of a behavior contract type thing. Because how can you determine, asking the student what to do when you don't have that information, what the triggers are, what helps, what doesn't help. So again, that would be a good reason to give us a call. We can talk you through that. So
And request that the district provide you with a written copy of their discipline policy, because the district must apply their discipline policies evenly. They can't discriminate against a student with a disability. So sometimes the behavioral contract, that may be a consideration. So make sure you understand what those policies are, ask for it in writing, and if you feel that they're applying those policies unevenly, you have the right to address that with the district also.
Okay, one more just came in. What if the student's masking and makes up stories to please the person who's doing the assessment? That's the reason that it has to come from both formal and informal data gathering, observations, interviews, how they're performing in class. That's why it's an evaluation cannot include just those formal assessments.
And a lot of those assessments are standardized assessments for that reason. One of the reasons anyway.
So, all right, well, thank you, everybody. Somebody did ask me if we're going to be sending that sample evaluation plan, and yes, I will include that in the resources that we sent to you. So, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Great to have you here, and thanks for the fantastic questions. It really added a lot to the time we had together. Have a great
Right.
day. Enjoy the snow, at least
I
if
will.
you're in our area. Bye-bye.
With that, I'll end today's webinar.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Jamie.